Édition spéciale du Techlash avec un invité exceptionnel, Richard Florida, professeur à l'Université de Toronto et auteur et originateur du concept de la Creative Class, la classe créative. Nous revenons avec Richard Florida sur l'historicité du Techlash et particulièrement les possibles effets du Techlash sur les centres urbains surdéveloppés à la tech, la côte ouest et la côte est des États-Unis. Professor Florida, thank you very much for your time. And I want to jump into my first question, which is you and I have been trading tweets on the historical perspective in this tech clash. Do you see this as in the vein of the Standard Oil trust busting or something more tailored like Microsoft 1998?
Well, first of all, thank you for doing this important podcast, and thank you for having me on. Um, I think it is a little bit of both, but it's more like what happened during really the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the great wave of trusts and that trust busting effort that confronted Standard Oil and others. But I will say, I was in New York City. We did a roundtable conference with some of the fellows at our institute, the Martin Prosperity Institute, with Roger Martin. And Roger, who was a consultant at Monitor before he became dean of the Rotman School, said that this very much reminded him of the efforts that were, targeted not only at Microsoft but at AT&T, and that tech companies had to be aware. But I think this is something bigger. Those were big things, don't get me wrong, but I think this mounting backlash to big tech, and I would say primarily, what Scott Galloway calls the big four or maybe five, obviously Facebook would be the clearest example, but I think it's building with Amazon, with Alphabet or Google, maybe less so with Apple, and certainly building with Uber and Airbnb, two companies that Scott Galloway in his book on big tech says, would be aspirants to the big four. And we're talking on a day not far after, the president, whether you like him or you don't, I don't like him, but had a tweet saying basically, Amazon is a pretty bad company, and it's screwing over the U.S. Postal Service, I think he said, and it should be looked at in terms of anti-competitive or trust-busting measures. But I do think the market power of these companies, these big tech companies, is something we haven't seen since the market power of that great wave of industrial revolution companies, the Standard Oil companies, the big automobile companies, even more so than the big automobile companies. They were competing with one another, the great railroad companies, the big banks. So yes, and I think people say, well, people like tech companies, but if you look at how fast things have come upon Facebook, I think these companies are seeing their popular support erode. So I think, to me, there was an industrial revolution. It led to this enormous concentration of market power a century or so, a little more than a century ago. There is now a knowledge revolution, a knowledge economic revolution. It's a kind of a new economy. We've actually looked at in our institute the changing nature of corporate headquarters, the leading top corporate headquarters. And, even as late as 1980, there were a lot of industrial concerns in there. Now it's just a who's who of high-tech knowledge economy companies. So I think in general, this backlash, this burgeoning backlash, looks more like that of the Industrial Revolution than things we've seen more recently.
I think that's very interesting because it seems to me that there is a lack of historical knowledge in the media, historical knowledge among politicians, and very few look back to history as a guide. And I, for one, do that because that's my training. I know you do as well. And it's interesting, what I call the ahistorical nature of Silicon Valley and the fact that it's almost like the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world have never opened a history book, and they're just discovering this for the first time. It's just something I do not understand. Do you think they are being naive or just extremely hubristic?
Both, both. I think we are now becoming aware of the hubris and the naivete of these folks. And I think it's also this kind of libertarian utopianism, the whole idea, that really is part of the founding myth of Silicon Valley, and in a way lovely. It comes out of kind of the hippie culture and the counterculture, and it was bound up in the whole Earth catalog and the early hacker movement and Stuart Brand and the Well and the Grateful Dead and all of this and that, that somehow this new technology, created by hippies as part of the counterculture would overturn society. And I think in many ways, even people like me fell victim to part of that. There was an excitement, a sense of the new, the knowledge economy. These were different kinds of companies. They cloak themselves in progressive values. Of course, they were from the Bay Area, from Seattle. They were West Coast companies that people didn't have to wear a suit and a tie. They could have long hair. They could have spiky hair. They could have tattoos. They could wear earrings. All things I wrote about in Rise of the Creative Class. They were gay friendly and lesbian friendly. They were liberal in terms of their political outlook. But I think more than that, that was more gloss than substance. I think they really believed this idea that, markets would change the world, and they were so far-seeking and far-seeing and omniscient, they would help change the world. And, maybe some of the things they did were good and important and part of progress, but now, boy, oh boy, they've just opened up a whole can of worms. And I think, yeah, you're right. The media's ahistorical. Our conversation, certainly in the United States, is ahistorical. I'm reminded of Marx's great quote, history comes around the first time as tragedy and the second time as farce. I think the other thing that's really relevant here is that at other times of great historical change, historical crises, economic crises, the rise of these new socioeconomic, political economic orders, America was in a lucky position in that it always elected kind of the best possible government. Maybe, you could go back and poke at FDR or whoever. But, at the Civil War, the United States elected Abraham Lincoln. During the Great Depression, the United States elected FDR. During this great period of transformation and crisis, the United States elected one of those backward-looking figures in its history or in the history of modern. I mean, there are a few worse ones, but Donald Trump is pretty awful. So I also think that the United States, in the midst of this, is stuck in the absence of a federal government with it's not only ahistorical, without a functioning brain. So yeah, and I think this is part of what's causing the backlash. I think if we had a federal government run by somebody like Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or anyone, Mitt Romney, on the Republican side, I think that people would be saying, let's look to the federal government to help us think through these problems that we're seeing in the West Coast, in the Bay Area, in Seattle. I think with Trump in office, the backlash against these companies has become worse. Because in many ways, without a federal government to protect people or to do things, people are just pointing a finger and saying, well, you're the victim, you're to blame, you didn't help me out, you're screwing me over. Maybe you put Trump in, or you help put Trump in office. So I think the Techlash is in part a reaction to the hubris and naivete of these companies, but also in part a reaction to the absence to the election of Trump and the absence of any kind of federal protections.
I think it's a very interesting point that is very seldom made, so thank you for making it. Now, in direct link to this, since you're the originator of the creative class, what do you foresee as potential immediate or midterm urban development effects because of the Techlash in San Francisco, but also New York and potentially Toronto?
Well, I looked at Amazon as kind of a model company in my book, Rise of the Creative Class. And they were the first company really to seek out an urban location in an old hospital building in Seattle. And then they took over what Paul Allen had acquired and developed in South Lake Union. And I saw them as a shift to a more urban model of tech. But they weren't the kind of monopoly power. They weren't doing this ludicrous and I think horrible. The worst thing I've seen in economic development in my career is their HQ2 competition, pitting these cities against cities to extract incentives and creating really a race to the bottom among communities across the United States and Canada, and then not allowing them to disclose what they're doing to their voters, making them sign non-disclosure agreements. So I'm of two minds on this. On the one hand, I think that this group of companies, the big four, have such monopolistic or quasi-monopolistic, or if not monopolistic, such extraordinary market power that they have made the Bay Area and Seattle predominant tech locations, knowledge hubs. They have helped them ascend the ladder. And, my own work, I show the increasing dominance of the Bay Area. The Bay Area had about 22% of venture capital-backed startups in 1995. It now has 45%. But on the other hand, I think their demise might be the one thing that could strengthen these existing knowledge hubs. It may be the case that having these large companies are in effect weakening, driving up housing prices, making things less affordable, sucking up huge amounts of talent. And it could well be that any limiting effect on the power of the big tech companies might reinforce the position of the Bay Area, of Seattle, and of this New York, Boston, Washington, Acela corridor. So my own take on this is that the incumbent tech centers that are already in place are likely to be the ones that are with us for a while. I don't think we're going to see new entrants in the United States. I think there's a mythology about the rise of the rest, the rise of Pittsburgh, or the rise of Nashville, or the rise of wherever. I think that mythology is just confronted by the data, which suggests not one of these rise of the rest places attracts more than 0.5% of all venture capital-backed startups in the world, in the United States. The question of Toronto is a different question. And I do think, if the Trump administration was to stay in power, or Trump-leaning Republicans were to stay in power for a while, I think that the restrictions on immigration, the sense of the United States as kind of a rogue or pariah nation, the gun violence in the United States, in high schools, I'm an American. I spent a lot of my time in the United States, and you hear people saying, and mainly this is not Americans. This is mainly foreign-born people who came to the United States. I'm out. I've had it. The place is too conservative. It's a pariah nation. I don't like living here. I don't like raising my kids here. And, I can give one example. Where I teach at the University of Toronto now is considered to have one of the best artificial intelligence units, a propagator of artificial intelligence. It's why Google established a lab there. It's why tech companies have been flocking from the United States and elsewhere to Toronto. The reason Toronto has a leg up in artificial intelligence, it attracted a guy named Jeffrey Hinton from Carnegie Mellon, where I used to teach in 1980 or so. And the reason Jeffrey Hinton, who's a British person, went to the University of Toronto is he didn't like Ronald Reagan. And he also didn't like the fact that in the United States, research was funded by the Defense Department. He's just not a guy who likes the military. And he decided to go to a place like Toronto, before it was a well-developed center, city, even a well-developed university as it is today. And he built his artificial intelligence career there. And now he's one of the leading lights in the world. I think now is an even bigger shift. And I do think that what we're likely to see in terms of the rise of the rest could be a Toronto, it could be a Berlin, it could be places in Asia. I'm trying to look at the data now. But the data certainly are suggestive that what would happen is less likely that next alternative high-tech hub would emerge in the United States. Much more likely that if it were to emerge, it would emerge in a place like Toronto, or maybe London, or Berlin, or Shanghai. So yeah, I think the future is bright. That said, as someone who lives in Toronto and loves the city, Toronto has an uncanny ability to screw itself over, and we're seeing that. We saw that with the election of Rob Ford, a squandered 4 years of opportunity, and now we're seeing it with the rise of Doug Ford. And Toronto's ability to now attract U.S. investment, attract global talent. If Doug Ford were to become premier, essentially the person who runs the great province of Ontario, you could imagine all sorts of loony things happening, like cutbacks in transit investment, cutbacks investment that would have otherwise gone to the city of Toronto, cutbacks in the university funding for Toronto and Waterloo and Western. So what I worry about is even though everything seems to be looking bright for Toronto, will Toronto have the wherewithal to take this step? Or will Torontonians and Ontarians end up electing, a mini Trump, or maybe the brother of the original Trump, Doug Ford, in a sense, muddying their own water. So that's something I worry about a lot these days.
Not to worry. I'm in Montreal, and we're all ready to take over from Toronto as a brother city. So,
Look, I think the future looks pretty bright for Montreal. I did a study of Montreal about 10 or 15 years ago, in which we were already looking at the music scene and the creative scene and the rise of bands that were not then popular, like Arcade Fire and the Incubator. Montreal has always been, in many ways, Canada's most innovative and creative city. It had other things happen to it. We all know the history,
yep,
but I do think, given its proximity to the United States, given its proximity to the New York, Boston, Washington corridor,
yep.
given its housing prices are more expensive than they were, but relatively affordable housing, and given the fact that it also has many leading lights in artificial intelligence, which is a next wave technology, and a great urban fabric. Yeah, I think Montreal could be yet another place that certainly, before I would see a Pittsburgh or Detroit rising as the rest, I would take a look at a place like Montreal or not, other places outside the United States having great potential.
Well, thank you very much for your time today, and I look forward to more interesting conversations in the near future.
Thank you. It's great talking with you.
Likewise.
Bye.